Hi everyone, welcome back. So in this recording, we will be talking about multi-stage surveys. In the past few recordings, we've taken the time to talk about the different approaches to sampling. And one might wonder, why have we just been talking about sampling and sampling and sampling? Because the whole purpose of a survey is for you to be able to talk to a smaller number of units or collect information on a smaller number of units, but yet be able to draw inferences about your target population. Now, whether the inferences will be valid about your target population depends intricately on how you have selected the sample, your actual study sample from this target population, and how you analyze the data that you collect from them in such a way that is consistent with your sampling approach and also consistent with the relationship between your sample and the target population. In real life, most of these ideal sampling techniques that we have talked about would not be sufficient for us to contain the logistic complexities of complex surveys while still preserving the technical rigor of those surveys. But the fact that we understand how each of them is done and the limitations and advantages of each of them can help us to be able to come up with a scheme that mixes and matches different features of all these sampling approaches creatively to come up with a sampling plan for our survey. So what happens is that we get a multi-stage survey. And what's a multi-stage survey? It is because most of the time, when we are conducting surveys, we are conducting surveys over very large expanses of geography. Or we are conducting so for instance, we are conveying, if you're talking about conducting a survey because you want to understand to what extent people's educational levels in the United States is related to their choice of presidential candidates. Think about the geography of the United States. We know that a simple random sample is technically rigorous, and the analysis of the data that emanates from such survey is very straightforward. But think about the logistics of going up and down the nooks and crannies of the United States if you need to do that. Even if we choose to just do clusters around the United States, say we want to use clusters like counties, think about how many counties you would have and think about the range of geography you might need to cover to go to all those counties in the United States if you have to just randomly select counties. And you don't have all the time in the world and all the resources in the world to conduct this service. So sometimes what we end up doing is to consider multiple stages. For instance, we might say, okay, the first thing is to say, let's look at all the states in the US. Let's randomly sample a minimal amount out of all the states in the US, that being our first stage of sampling. But after we have selected, maybe we have selected 10 states randomly, which we believe should roughly be representative of all the other states. Now, even just 10 states, if we choose to go and enumerate everybody in just 10 states, imagine what a logistic nightmare that can be. So we might decide that the second stage is that within these 10 states, we go to each of them and randomly select 4 or 5 counties from each of them, meaning there's a second stage of sampling. Now, after selecting counties, you might want to check again. Is it possible to go to all the households in the counties? At that stage, you might say, well, maybe for each of the county, we should do another random sample. So in essence, you've done a simple random sampling in 3 different stages. But the whole of your data collection activity might be restricted to just about 4 counties in each of 10 states, meaning 40 counties. All your data collection workforce will need to operate within 40 counties in the United States. And when they go to each of those counties, they get a list of the households in these counties, and they randomly select a fixed number of households. That is how surveys end up being practically implemented. It is hard to look at a wide expanse of geography like the United States and just conduct a simple random sampling throughout the country. Such a survey might take months and months and months and unlimited time. So to limit such a logistic challenge and the cost, we end up doing sampling at multiple stages so that the geographical area where activity will occur, it might still be the same number of individuals that we will be selecting, but the geographical area that we will need to traverse would become limited. But let's also remember that this is an advantage, but there's also a trade-off in terms of design effect that we talked about the other time. That we talked about when we're talking about cluster sampling. So in essence, the total number of people that we might need to include in our survey to have the same power might need to increase. But despite increasing the number of people, we will be increasing them in circumscribed geographies. Collecting information from 5,000 people within 40 defined counties in the United States might be easier than collecting information from 2,000 people that are scattered all around the nooks and crannies of the whole of the United States. And that is the logic of multi-stage sampling. So at the end of the day, when you have multi-stage sampling, it improves the logistics of your survey becomes easier to manage because the defined locations, the defined geographies, the geographies where your survey participants will be located are kind of circumscribed. It's not over the whole of the geography. Now, the question someone might ask is that now these counties might have different compositions than other counties that end up not being selected in the study. That's true. And that is why we have to think about the fact that the fundamental approach to sampling for a survey is the simple random sampling. And therefore, we have to think about in what way might our design, our multi-stage design, have deviated from the simple random sampling? And how do we need to adjust to be able to get still get the same information, the same rigorous information we would have gotten had we taken the time to go around all through the nooks and crannies of this country to meet the participants that would have been selected if we have done the simple random sampling. And one thing that some very smart mathematicians have been able to show us is that if we understand how each of the steps we have taken in each of these stages affects the probability of selection of everybody within the country, we might be able to adjust our results to still be representative of the distribution of the country. And that brings us to sampling weights. So That is why it is very important in each of the stages for us to look at the size of the clusters we're looking at, because the size of the clusters, like we described during when we talked about cluster sampling, the difference in the size of the clusters actually affects the probability of each individual in each of the clusters to be sampled. So some people have come up with some smart ways, including one approach is to ensure that in your sample generator, your random sample generator, the clusters are sampled, the probability of sampling each cluster is proportional to the size of the cluster. Where that's not possible, we can still estimate the probability of sampling each individual based on these sizes. And we can use that probability to construct what we call sampling weights. And that sampling weight can be used to adjust our findings in such a way that it would still be representative of the composition of our target population. So the sample weights typically is just the inverse of the probability selection of each individual unit in our target population. So, you know, if those probabilities are different, if all the clusters had equal probability of being selected, then probability of the units in each of the clusters will be different unless the clusters are of equal size. So DHS is a very famous example of a multi-stage survey. I mean, DHS usually is the survey that the demographic and health survey is the survey that covers whole countries. And therefore, it's a good example of the kind of logistical challenges and the trade-off between logistical challenges and technical rigor that a multi-stage sampling is designed to address. So, in the design of the DHS study, the first thing that happens is that the whole country is divided into clusters. Now, each of those clusters now will be divided. Most of the time, the clusters kind of correspond to administrative units. It might be around counties, it might be around census tracts. Now, each of the clusters will now be divided into a segment. Segment is roughly, approximately an area that represents 500 people. Of course, there will be different amounts of segments in each of the clusters. So just like we described earlier, the first selection would be to randomly select which clusters to go to. And then the next level of selection would be to randomly select segments in each of the clusters. And then in each of the segments, depending on the size of segments, they can go to selected segments and enumerate every single person or every single household in each of the selected segments. But better still, a random sample of households in each of those segments might still be implemented. The EPI 30x7 cluster survey is a typical survey used for the evaluation of immunization programs. So usually 30 clusters are selected and 7 individuals or 7 households in each of the clusters. Basically 30 communities are random selected out of all the communities in the coverage area. 7 individuals in each of the 30 communities are interviewed, making 210 households. So this essentially is what the so for most surveys, most of the surveys we see out there, they end up being complex surveys. And in practical terms, most of the surveys end up being complex surveys in which we end up doing multiple layers, multiple stages of sampling, and we mix and match the different sampling approaches across each of these stages. And when it comes to the reason why we have talked about all this is that each of these approaches have implications for how we analyze the data and how we draw inference from the survey that we have conducted. Thank you.